My name is Harlan Webb, and I've been a carpenter for 41 years. I know how wood works. I know that the grain of a piece of oak will tell you everything you need to know about how it was grown, whether it had good years or hard ones, whether the roots went deep or stayed shallow. I spent 4 decades reading wood that way. Turns out, I wasn't as good at reading people. I'm 63 years old, and for the past 8 months, I've been watching my son and his wife look at me the way a developer looks at an old building. Not for what it is, but for what the land underneath it might be worth. Last Tuesday, they sat me down in my own kitchen. The kitchen my late wife June and I tiled ourselves in the summer of 1987, and they slid a folder across the table to me like they were closing a deal. They smiled. They held hands. They used words like transition and proactive planning and the next chapter. I just nodded and sipped my coffee and told them I'd think about it. I did not tell them that I had already thought about it. I did not tell them that June had already thought about all of it, years before either of them had the idea. When I left that kitchen table, I went straight to my workshop, picked up the phone, and called a woman named Ruth Aldridge, Esquire. And that is where this story really begins. To understand what happened that Tuesday morning, I have to take you back to the months before it. June passed 11 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. She fought it for 14 months, and she fought it the way she did everything, quietly, with dignity, and with a plan. She was a bookkeeper for 30 years. She worked for 3 different small businesses in Clarksville, Tennessee before retiring, and she brought her work home with her in the best possible way. She kept records of everything, every receipt, every contract, every loan, every dollar that ever moved in or out of our household. I used to tease her about it. June, I'd say, you track our grocery spending like it's a Fortune 500 company. She'd just look at me over the top of her reading glasses and say, Harlan, somebody in this house has to. She was right. She was always right. Our son Damon is 40 years old. He's a good-looking man. He got June's eyes and my jaw, and for a long time I was proud of the person I thought he was becoming. He works in sales for a medical device company out of Nashville. Good salary, company car, expense account. His wife, Rochelle, is an interior designer. She has a gift for walking into a room and immediately calculating what everything in it costs. I noticed that the first time Damon brought her home for Thanksgiving 12 years ago. She looked around our living room at the handmade bookshelves and the stone fireplace I had built, and I could see her doing arithmetic behind her eyes. At the time, I thought I was imagining it. I was not imagining it. The first call came 3 weeks after June's funeral. It was Damon. His voice gentle and careful the way it gets when he wants something and knows he has to approach it slowly. Dad, I've been thinking, he said. You've got a lot of square footage out there in that house, and you're by yourself now. That's a big place for one person. I told him I was aware of the square footage. I had built half of it myself. He laughed a little too quickly. I know. I just mean, have you thought at all about simplifying? There are some really nice communities down here closer to us in Brentwood, places with amenities, social activities, people your age. I told him I had people my age right here in Clarksville. I told him I had my workshop, my neighbors, my church. I had the garden June planted that still had things coming up in it. He said he understood. He said he just wanted me to be happy. He said we'd talk more at Christmas. We talked more before Christmas. 2 weeks later, Rochelle called. She does not do gentle or careful. Rochelle is efficient. Harlan, she said, using my first name the way she always does, like she's correcting a document. I want to be straight with you because I think you appreciate directness. I braced myself. The property market in Montgomery County right now is extraordinary. I had a colleague pull comps on your street last week. Your house and that 3-acre lot, we're talking 1.4, maybe 1.5 million. And that doesn't account for what a developer would pay for the timber acreage you've got behind the fence line. She paused to let the numbers settle. That money could set you up beautifully for the rest of your life. A nice condo, a financial cushion, no more worrying about maintenance or property taxes or that old roof. I looked out the window at June's vegetable garden, at the raised beds I had built her from cedar planks, still holding their shape after 8 winters. I looked at the workshop where I'd spent the better part of 4 decades making things with my hands. I told Rochelle I would think about it. She told me not to think too long. Markets move fast. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the quiet. There is a particular kind of silence in a house where someone is gone. It isn't peaceful. Not at first. It's the silence of a room where all the furniture is still arranged around a person who is no longer there. For a few months after June passed, that silence was the hardest thing I had ever endured. But somewhere around the 7th month, something shifted. The silence became familiar. It became mine. And sitting there after Rochelle's call, in that familiar quiet, I started to understand something clearly for the first time. They weren't worried about me being lonely. They were worried about being patient. Damon called again 2 days before Thanksgiving. He'd been talking to a financial guy, he said. He had put together a projection sheet. He used words like estate liquidity and capital deployment and maximizing the asset before the market softens. My son, who couldn't balance a checkbook until he was 25, was explaining asset maximization to me. I let him talk. I took notes. I told him it was a lot to consider, and we'd discuss it at Christmas. The next morning I went to June's desk. June's desk was a roll top in the corner of our bedroom. She'd had it since before we were married, an old piece her father had left her. Solid cherry wood that I had refinished twice over the years. She kept it locked, which I had always respected. After she passed, I found the key in the pocket of her winter coat, exactly where she had told me it would be, in a note she had left folded inside the cover of the Bible on her nightstand. The note said, "Harlan, when you need it, the key is in the left coat pocket. Gray wool. The desk will explain everything. I love you." June. She had been sick, and she had still found the time to write me instructions. That was June. I opened the desk and found 4 things. A small green lockbox, a legal-sized envelope sealed with her handwriting across the flap, open with Ruth, a single business card, and a letter addressed to me in her neat bookkeeper's script. I sat down on the edge of the bed and read the letter first. She had written it 6 months before she passed. She told me she loved me. She told me she was not afraid. She told me she was proud of what we'd built. And then, in that pragmatic way of hers that always made me feel both deeply loved and slightly managed, she told me to be careful. "I've watched Rochelle for 12 years, she wrote. "I have kept my opinions to myself because she is Damon's choice, and I respect that. But I know what she sees when she looks at this house, at our land, at you. I need you to be smarter than your heart, Harlan. You are the most generous man I have ever known, and that is your greatest quality and your greatest vulnerability. I have taken some steps to make sure your generosity cannot be used against you. Ruth will explain. Trust her. She knows everything." I read the letter twice. Then I sat with it in my hands for a long time, in the quiet that had become mine, and I let myself feel the full weight of what it meant to be loved by a woman who had seen everything coming and had still, in the middle of her own dying, made a plan to protect me. When I finally opened the green lockbox, I found her ledgers. June kept 3 composition notebooks, the black and white speckled kind you see in school, supply aisles. She had labeled the spine of each one in her careful hand. They covered 14 years of transactions. Every dollar we had ever given Damon, every loan that had somehow never become a repayment, every temporary help that had quietly become permanent. I opened the first one and started to read, and somewhere around the 3rd page I had to set it down and walk outside and stand in the cold November air for a while. The numbers were not what I expected. I had given Damon money over the years, of course. You help your children. You don't keep score. Except June had kept score, because June understood something I didn't, that someday score would matter. There was the $45,000 we gave them when they bought their house in Brentwood in 2015. I had thought of it as a gift, a father's contribution to his son's future. June's note next to that entry read, "Damon mentioned paying it back once." Rochelle was in the room. She changed the subject. There was the $18,000 for Rochelle's business expansion loan when the bank turned her down in 2018, the money she needed to open a second studio. I had felt proud that day handing over that check. I had felt like a useful father. June's note. Rochelle did not say thank you. Damon said it for her. There was $12,000 in smaller amounts spread over 3 years for what the receipts described as cash flow gaps and what I had understood to be temporary rough patches. There was the $8,500 for the transmission on Rochelle's SUV. There was the recurring annual payment to a private school in Nashville where my 2 grandchildren, children I adore with everything I have, attended at a tuition that was beyond what Damon and Rochelle could actually afford without our subsidy. I added it up on the back of an envelope, the old-fashioned way with a pencil, the way my father had taught me. Then I did it again because I didn't believe the first answer. Over 14 years, we had given our son and his wife a total of $214,700. Built a bedroom addition onto our house with my own hands for less than half that, and not a dollar of it had ever come back. I sat with the ledgers in my lap in June's chair at her desk, and I thought about how many early mornings I had spent in that workshop, how many custom jobs, cabinet installations, furniture commissions, how many years of my knees and my back and my hands, all of it distilled down to a number that my son had accepted and his wife had directed, without either of them ever seeming to think it was anything other than their due. I picked up the business card. Ruth Aldridge, attorney at law, estate planning and trust administration, Clarksville, TN. I called the next morning. Ruth Aldridge's office was on the second floor of a converted Victorian on Main Street, the kind of building where the stairs creak, but the work inside is serious. Ruth herself was a small woman in her late 50s, with short silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She had a Tennessee accent and a way of folding her hands on her desk that reminded me of a schoolteacher who had seen every variety of student and was still paying attention. When June and I had met with her 2 years before June passed, she had been warm and patient with us. Now, seeing her behind her desk with June's sealed envelope between us, I saw something else in her, a readiness, a quiet alertness, like a person who had been waiting for something to begin. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. She said it without any judgment, just a fact. I handed her the sealed envelope. She opened it carefully, read its contents for several minutes without speaking, then looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as appreciation. "Your wife," she said, setting the papers down, "was one of the most thoughtful clients I have ever had the privilege of working with." She walked me through it. June had not written a simple will. She had drafted, 2 years before she passed, a revocable living trust that, upon her death, converted to an irrevocable arrangement. 75% of her legal share of our marital estate, the house, the land, the timber acreage, was placed into a charitable remainder trust. The trust would provide income to me for the rest of my life, and upon my death, the principal would pass to a fund June had established and named the June Webb Vocational Scholarship, dedicated to providing tools, materials, and training stipends to students enrolled in trade programs at the Tennessee College of Applied Technology campuses across the state. Carpentry, masonry, plumbing, HVAC, force rue, the trades, the work our hands had done. The remaining 25% of her share of the estate, her portion of the savings, the investments, what was left, was to pass to Damon. But that distribution, Ruth explained with quiet precision, was contingent upon the settlement of all outstanding loans documented in the family ledgers, which June had appended as exhibits to the trust agreement. As legally recorded gifts with documented expectations of repayment, they could be offset against any inheritance. "The total documented," Ruth said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk to me, "is $214,700. Damon's share of the marital estate from your wife's portion comes to approximately $180,000. She paused. "The debt exceeds the inheritance," I said. "By just over $34,000, Ruth said, "which means, under the terms June set out, the net distribution to Damon is 0. I sat with that word for a moment. 0. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the complicated, hollow ache of a man who had raised a son and was now reading the legal record of that son's choices. "What do I do now?" I asked. Ruth smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who was very good at their job. "Now," she said, "we invite them to a meeting." I called Damon that evening. I did not do it with pleasure. I made my voice sound tired, which was not difficult because I was tired. "Son," I said, "I've been thinking about what you and Rochelle have been saying. I want to get my affairs in order. I think it's time. I've already spoken to my attorney, and she's agreed to sit down with all of us. Can you come up on Saturday?" The pause before he answered told me everything. It was the pause of a man calculating. "Of course, Dad," he said, and his voice had softened into something I recognized from his childhood, the voice he used when he was about to get what he wanted. "We'll be there. Don't worry about a thing." I could hear Rochelle in the background when he covered the phone, not well enough. Her voice came through anyway, clipped and bright. "Tell him not to sign anything before we get there." I hung up and looked at the wall at my workshop for a long time. There was a framed photograph there, June and me at the county fair in 2003. Both of us sunburned and laughing at something neither of us could probably remember anymore. I spoke to it, to her, the way I had started doing sometimes in the months since she'd been gone. "You thought of everything," I said. "You always thought of everything." Saturday arrived with a clear, cold December sky. I drove to Ruth's office early and we reviewed the materials one final time. Ruth had prepared 4 copies of a document she called a summary of family account history, a clean, formatted version of June's ledger entries organized by year with a total at the bottom. She placed them in plain manila folders. She did not decorate them or explain them on the cover. She wanted the numbers to do the work. Damon and Rochelle arrived 7 minutes late. I noticed because Rochelle was the kind of person who was always precisely on time when she wanted to make an impression, and a few minutes late when she wanted to establish that her time was valuable. She had dressed for the occasion. A charcoal blazer, tall boots, a leather portfolio under her arm as if she were attending a real estate closing, which I supposed she believed she was. Damon wore his good sport coat, the navy one June had helped him pick out. I noticed he could not quite meet my eyes when he shook my hand. They took their seats across the conference table. Ruth sat at the head, her files neatly stacked in front of her. I sat beside Ruth, which I could tell unsettled them slightly. They had expected to find me across from them, in the position of the person being managed. "Mr. Webb," Ruth began, "has asked me to convene this meeting to review the status of the family estate, including some documentation that came to light following Mrs. Webb's passing." Rochelle opened her leather portfolio. "We've also prepared some materials," she said, setting a folder on the table. "A proposal for an orderly transition of the real property, including a timeline for listing." "We'll get there," Ruth said. Her voice was not unkind. It had the particular patience of someone who knows the other person's proposal is beside the point. I slid the manila folders across the table before she could continue. One to Damon, one to Rochelle, each of them their own copy. "Before we discuss anything going forward," I said, "I think it's important you see where we're starting from." Damon opened his slowly. Rochelle opened hers the way she did everything, immediately, efficiently, and her eyes moved down the first page with the quick focus of someone reading a contract. She had processed what she was seeing before Damon had finished the first column. I watched her face. The color left it, not all at once, but in stages, like a tide going out. Damon turned a page, then another. He set the folder flat on the table and looked up at me, and for the first time in a long time, he looked like my son instead of a man who had learned to perform having a father. "Dad," he said, and his voice had something real in it. "I didn't know she kept all this." "Your mother kept everything," I said. "You knew that." "These numbers," he started, "are accurate," I said, "to the penny." Rochelle had been quiet, which was more alarming than anything she could have said. When she spoke, her voice was controlled in the way that things are controlled when they are about to come apart. "This isn't a legal document," she said to Ruth. "These are personal notebooks. They're not binding. They are appended as exhibits to the trust agreement your mother-in-law executed 2 years before her death," Ruth said, opening her own file, "which was prepared, witnessed, and notarized in this office. The ledgers are incorporated by reference into the legal terms of the trust. They are very much binding." "What trust?" Damon said. He was still on the ledger pages. I don't think he had looked up. "The June Webb Living Trust," Ruth said, "converting upon her death to an irrevocable charitable remainder trust. Your mother was quite specific about her intentions." She opened the document and read the relevant sections in a voice that was calm and matter-of-fact, the voice of someone presenting information that requires no embellishment. When she reached the part about the Tennessee College of Applied Technology Scholarship Fund, I saw Damon's jaw tighten. When she reached the part about the contingent distribution and the offset of documented loans, I heard Rochelle set her leather portfolio on the table with a sound like a door closing. There was a long silence. "Zero," Rochelle said. She said the word like she was testing whether it was real. "The outstanding debt, as documented, exceeds your husband's share by approximately $34,000, Ruth said. "Under the terms of the trust, the net distribution is 0. What happened next is something I have thought about many times in the months since. I had expected anger. I had expected Rochelle especially to argue, to threaten, to produce her own folder with her own numbers and her own version of events. I had expected Damon to defer to her, the way he had learned to do over 12 years. What I did not expect was for my son to put his elbows on the table, press his face into his hands, and not make a sound for a full minute. Rochelle filled the silence differently. Her voice, when it came, was sharp and aimed at Damon. "I told you we should have handled this differently. I told you we needed to move faster before he had time to stop, Damon said. He said it quietly into his hands, and then he lifted his face and he looked at her, and the look on his face was something I had not seen there in a long time. It was clarity, the kind that costs something. Just stop. She stopped. And in the silence that followed for just a moment, the two of them were exactly what they were. Two people who had built a life on a foundation they had never examined, and were now looking at the actual ground. Damon turned to me. His eyes were red at the edges. Mom knew, he said. It wasn't a question. Your mother knew everything, I said. She loved you anyway. She loved me enough to make sure I'd be all right. He nodded. He looked back down at the folder. He turned to one page near the back where June had written a note in the margin. I had memorized it by then, next to an entry from 2019. Gave Damon and Rochelle the money for the expansion loan today. Harlan was so happy to help. He is the most giving man I know, and it is the thing I love most about him and the thing that worries me most. I hope I'm wrong about where this is heading. I hope when the time comes, Damon remembers who he is. He read it twice. I could tell by the movement of his eyes. Rochelle stood up. She picked up her portfolio, and she looked at me, and I will say this for her. She did not apologize. We both knew an apology would have been worse than what she said, which was nothing. She simply looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen on her face before, something that might have been the beginning of shame, and then she walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. We'll find our way through this, she said. Not to me, not to Damon, really to no one in particular. Then she left. Damon stayed. He sat at that conference table for another 20 minutes, turning pages, not speaking. Ruth quietly excused herself to give us the room. Eventually, he closed the folder and looked at me. I didn't know it was that much, he said. I know you didn't, I said. You're not the kind of man who calculates. That's not a criticism. Rochelle, he started. Rochelle, he started. Rochelle is who she is, I said. She's your choice. I've always respected that. He was quiet for a moment. Are you all right, Dad? I thought about the question. I thought about the workshop and the raised beds and the quiet house that had become mine over these months. I thought about the scholarship fund June had named and the students it would reach, young people who wanted to learn to make something real with their hands. I thought about the letter in June's handwriting that I had read so many times I no longer needed the paper. I'm the best I've been in a long time, I said. Your mother made sure of that. He nodded again. He stood up, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something important. Instead, he just squeezed my shoulder, briefly, the way men in our family have always done when we don't have the right words. Then he left. I sat alone in Ruth's conference room for a few minutes after he was gone, in a silence that was different from any I had known since June passed. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of something settled. That was 7 months ago. The scholarship had its first award ceremony in the spring. 12 students. Ruth attended. My neighbor Carol attended. My pastor attended. The TSAT campus director gave a short speech about what the June Webb Vocational Scholarship would mean to students in communities across the state, young people who wanted to work with their hands and needed someone to believe that work had value. When he said her name, June Webb, I felt it move through me the way a low chord moves through a room, not loud but present everywhere. I still work in my workshop most mornings. The light in there is good early, before the day gets going. Last week I finished a cherry writing desk for a woman over in Adams, a commission I had been working on since February. It was the most complex piece I'd made in years. I sat with it a long time when it was done, just looking at it, at the grain in the joints and the way the finish caught the light. June would have found a way to catalog it. She would have written the date and the dimensions and the client's name in her neat hand in a notebook somewhere, just to have a record, just to know that it was real. I am learning, slowly, to keep better records of my own. Not just the financial kind, though I have gotten more careful about those. The other kind. The kind you keep because someday someone may need to know that something happened, that something was built, that the work was real and it mattered, and someone showed up for it every day for 40 years without being asked. That is the thing about building something with your hands. It doesn't disappear when you stop looking at it. It holds its shape. It endures. Long after you're gone. If you built it right, it's still there, still doing what you made it to do. June knew that. She built something that would outlast all of it, the anger, the disappointment, the money, the silence. She built it for me, and I am still living inside it. I think about that moment a lot. The moment Damon closed the folder and just sat there, not saying anything, his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. I had expected a fight. I had been bracing for it the whole drive over. What I got instead was something quieter and, in a way, harder to sit with. Silence from your own son has a weight that anger doesn't. But here's what I've come to understand in the months since. What happened in that conference room wasn't luck, and it wasn't strategy. Not mine anyway. It was the result of a life lived a certain way, catching up with itself. June kept those ledgers because she was an honest woman who believed that honest records matter. Damon and Rochelle made those withdrawals year after year because they'd learned that generosity without limits has no limits. Both of those things were true at the same time, and both of them had consequences that played out exactly the way they had to. I used to think that being a good father meant never keeping score. I meant it as a virtue. What I didn't understand, what June understood long before I did, is that there's a difference between generosity and surrender. Real integrity isn't just about giving freely. It's about knowing what you're giving and why, and whether the person receiving it is growing from it or just consuming it. I gave Damon money for 14 years and told myself it was love. It was love, but it was also a failure of a different kind, because I never asked him to stand on his own long enough to find out if he could. June saw that. She loved him anyway, and she protected me from the consequences of my own blind spot. And that is one of the most honest things anyone has ever done for me. What struck me most reading her notes in those ledgers was not the numbers. It was the intelligence behind them. She had watched and thought and recorded and planned, all while raising children and running a household and working full-time and, at the end, fighting a disease that would have consumed a lesser person entirely. She never told me what she was doing. She just did it, quietly, because she understood that wisdom isn't about announcing itself. It does its work in the background and you only see it clearly when you need it most. I am not a man who gives up easily. 41 years in the trade that asks everything of your body teaches you something about endurance. But there's a difference between the kind of stubbornness that gets you through hard winters and the kind that lets you walk out of a conference room with your peace intact when everything you built is being contested. That kind of steadiness. The kind that doesn't flinch, doesn't beg, doesn't explain itself to people who have already decided not to listen. That came from June, too. She modeled it every day of our marriage. I was just finally paying attention. Damon called me last week. We talked for a while. It was still awkward, still full of spaces where words should be. But he asked about the scholarship ceremony, about the students, about whether the cherry desk I'd been working on turned out the way I'd hoped. Small questions, real ones. I don't know what becomes of us from here, but I know that whatever it is, it will be built on something true, which is more than I could have said 8 months ago. June built that foundation. I am still learning how to live up to it.